You have the right to remain silent.
Just always keep in mind, whatever fact they verbalize, if it's a fact without God, it's no fact at all. Always keep that in mind. Whatever they assert within their framework rests upon nothing. Remember when Jesus said, "Without me, you can do nothing"? Well, that statement is much broader than most people realize. He upholds all things by the power of his will. Hebrews 1, Colossians 1, Genesis 1:1. So that's what pushing the antithesis is about. Always pushing the antithesis, the creator-creation distinction. When they reject the creator-creation distinction, okay, then they're going to opt for monism. Okay, there's no creator-creation distinction. So why does anything? Why if the creator isn't the origin point that provides for all states of affairs, then what does? What is it that is ultimately static and absolute? They're either going to say it's laws of nature or I don't know. But either way they answer, you've got them. You just have to be careful. They're going to use a lot of verbal legerdemain, verbal prestidigitation to try to distract you and segue onto semi-related topics. And you have to keep on pushing the antithesis. Say, good, you reject the creator-creation distinction. Good. What are you ultimately relying on then? We'll say, well, you haven't proven it. Say, well, you know what? God has proven himself, but you have deemed that the proof that he's given is insufficient, and God disagrees with you. But since your non-acceptance is a claim of fact and coherence, how is it coherent? The very statement of saying, look, how about somebody comes to you and says, prove to me God exists. That very imperative contains the presupposition of the non-existence of God. Because if he didn't hold to that implicit premise, then he would be holding to its opposite, that God exists. How many Christians go up to other Christians and say, prove to me God exists? Right? Now, you can say that about gold on Mars. I could say to you, truth speller, prove to me there's gold on Mars, because my existence doesn't depend upon gold on Mars. So I can truly be neutral about gold on Mars, or whether there's an even or odd number of jelly beans in a jar. But God is unlike any other thing. God is not something that you can be neutral about. Remember that book I keep telling you? The Myth of Religious Neutrality. We will be operating from some absolute. It'll either be God or not God. And so when somebody says to me, prove to me God exists, they're operating from the premise God does not exist. So you just simply say, well, in that demand, why do you start from the position God doesn't exist? And if they say, well, you're shifting the burden of proof, wait a minute. You gave me an imperative that contains the implicit premise that God doesn't exist. So why do you hold to that premise, that unstated premise? Okay? And then if they really keep on pushing, you say, prove to you God exists? Yeah, every fact indicates God. Every fact, the apple on the counter indicates. They'll say, well, that's ridiculous. Say, no, because without a personal absolute creator God, who is the property set of the Christian God, then we wouldn't be able to know anything. And if you don't accept that, then you're holding to the premise that there are things that are knowable and intelligible apart from God. Say, do you actually believe that? What are they going to say? No? And then when they say yes, they say, good. Do you have a good reason for that? You see, you turn the tables on them. You Mirandize them. Anything they say can and will be used against them. In other words, God is defined as the origin point. And so if somebody says that the acquisition of one fact doesn't require God as the origin point, then it follows from that position the denial of God's existence. Okay? It's because in a world where God exists, all facts have their origin point in God. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So there cannot be a fact in existence. There cannot be a fact that is intelligible without God. They say no God needed, then they have indirectly denied God. So that's why agnosticism is an indirect denial of God. They don't think they deny God, but they do. Right. And people say, well, how is Jesus the truth? Well, that's because truth is that which corresponds to the mind of God. Right? Truth is that which corresponds to the mind of God. Now, people want to say truth is that conforms to reality. Whose reality? Whose perspective determines what reality is? Only God's perspective determines it. And if our thoughts are in sync with God's thinking, then we have truth.
You have the right to remain silent.
I choose to waive that right.